Talofa lava, ia koe ali'i whakalofalai atu. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the next year's side event on climate change science for the Pacific. The Next Gen project is a partnership between SPREP and the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, or CSIRO, with financial support from the Government of Australia. CSIRO is one of the lead nodes and provider of climate change science for the Pacific. As vulnerable nations to slow and sudden onset hazards caused by climate change, the need for early warning information is quite critical to help our communities and our governments, our civil societies and our private sector to plan ahead. We therefore rely on this scientific information from our national meteorological services, as well as our science providers, such as CSIRO. We need this information in a timely manner in order for our communities and our governments and our civil societies and private sector to plan well ahead before this event takes place. We might not have time, most of the time. At the policy level, we need reliable and accessible scientific information to inform adaptation actions and mitigation measures that are tailored to meet the needs of our people, our sectors, that would help us all to work as a collective to build resilient communities. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming you all to this session that you hope will find fruitful, informative, and engaging. I encourage you all to ask as many questions as possible. You have a number of experts on the panel who will be able to respond to those questions. Without further ado, I now hand over to our moderator for this side event, Dr. Jeff Cooley. I thank you, Jeff. You have the floor.
Thanks, Philomena. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up? Yeah, thank you. Okay. And good evening and welcome to everyone participating in this event from Glasgow, the Pacific, and of course elsewhere, wherever you may be. Very quickly, thank you to our long-term and valued regional partner in SPREP for organising this event. It's a great opportunity for us to speak to you all this evening at this end and your morning at your end. So as Mina said, my name is Jeff Gooley. I'm a Program Manager for the CSIRO Climate Science Centre here in Melbourne, Australia, where I live. And for those who are unaware, CSIRO is Australia's national research agency, and the Climate Science Centre is the location of our core climate change science capability within the organisation. We're quite a large organisation, about 5,000 strong. Now, to recap before we get underway, the webinar is entitled Understanding Current and Future Climate Change, Science-Based Application for Pacific Resilience. The purpose of the webinar in brief is to discuss the state of scientific understanding of current and future climate change in the Pacific, in particular to unpack the IPCC AR6 Working Group 1 report, which was published recently, of course, and the very recently, just prior to COP, updated so-called next-gen country reports and what that all means for the Pacific. We'd also like to use this opportunity to raise awareness on practical application of climate change science and services in decision-making at all levels in the region. We'd like to share practical solutions on using science to inform services with key development sectors, and also potentially identify any opportunities to partner with other key stakeholders who have an interest in this space, including, dare I say, the private sector, who often are not involved in these technical discussions, but we would encourage their involvement. Now, we have approximately 45 minutes set aside for this webinar, and we've assembled an excellent panel of domain experts who will each introduce themselves briefly as they contribute to the discussion with an initial round of questions from myself. But we will, I think the organisers are, our colleagues in SPREP are putting up some brief bios for our speakers that will appear on the screen as they're talking, so you'll get a better understanding of who they are and their background. We'll hopefully also have time at the end for a brief open forum Q&A session with our audience before we wrap up, depending on what you'd like to talk about and if you have any questions for our panellists. So to get underway, I'd like to pose my first question to my CSC colleague at CSIRO, Michael Gross, who led the development of the recently published Next Gen Projections Science for the Pacific. And Michael, if you're ready to go, can you please provide a brief overview of the Next Gen projections, making specific reference to the recently published country reports that you led the science for, and how these align with or otherwise complement the recent release of the IPCC Working Group 1 report? Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks very much, everyone, for being here. So, yeah, I was very lucky to be involved in this project together with SPREP, the Med agencies, and CSIRO, looking to update and provide the latest understanding about climate projections as we move towards the next generation of climate services and what's really needed in the Pacific and around the world. So there's a few different components to this project. I'm just going to be talking about these updated to country reports, and this is for 15 partner countries in the Western Pacific, and it's really tackling some questions that are now really current that haven't been the focus before, such as how much has the region warmed since pre-industrial climate, which is now, of course, in the focus because of things like the Paris Agreement. And we can now say confidently that the region has warmed by around 0.8 degrees, which is less than the global average and less than the global land average. But really point out, importantly, that doesn't mean impacts are less in the region. We also put in context some of the variability and change through the past the historical period, and put in context the near-term climate and how the short-term trend could be offset or enhanced by climate variability on top of climate change trends. We also then present projections by global warming levels. This is if the world gets to 2 degrees, or 3 degrees, or 4 degrees, or remains at 1.5 degrees, then what does the region look like in terms of potential for warming and temperature change, and also mean rainfall change? We also provide some of the latest updates on the new research around sea levels and tropical cyclones and extremes. We provide a preview and explainer about the new SSPs and the new set of, that's the shared socioeconomic pathways, the new set of scenarios that will be used from now on to describe future climate, and also the latest round of climate modelling, the so-called CMIP6 set of climate models. We also provide a relatively simple way to think about the possible pathways forward to 2050, including the kind of physical climate change storyline that could get you there, with one dimension being emissions. The emissions pathway the world follows is, of course, a primary determinant of the climate of 2050 and beyond. And the other dimension being the primary physical driver of change, which varies in different regions of the Pacific, including the SPCZ, or South Pacific Convergence Zone, whether that moves north or south, compared to, say, regions that are affected by the Asia-Australia monsoon, and what happens to that, does it intensify or not? So we hope that this is a step towards the next generation of climate projections and climate services, climate change services that are needed in the Pacific. And this was just one part of the project, and now I'll hand over to colleagues to talk about some other components. Thanks very much, Jeff.
Thanks, Michael. And I do encourage anyone that's listening to this event and who are interested in these country reports, please do seek them out. They are available as PDF downloads on the rccap.org website. That's the URL. But our colleagues from SPREP or ourselves, please just contact us and we can point you in the right direction. And that material is available as of right now. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, who's also my colleague from the CSIRO CSC, Dr. Leanne Webb, who has led the development of the case studies, the sectoral applications of the next-gen science in the Pacific. So, Lan, can you please provide us with an overview of these case studies, making specific reference to how the projections have been applied in practice for undertaking hazard-based impact assessments to inform climate risk across the different sectors in the Pacific, please? Thanks, Leanne.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and thanks, everyone, for this opportunity. So in August in 2019, we were all invited to Samoa to take part in a workshop to discuss the next-gen projections. And we were strongly advised at the workshop that the projection science information is readily available, but it's not really being utilised by the Pacific stakeholders. So they recommended that what we could do is make the projections more relevant in terms of impacts for sectors. And so at the workshop, we came up with lots of roundtable discussions with proposal for what ended up being 6 different sectoral case studies. And so what these case studies are designed to do is to assist users of or people in the Pacific to understand how these quite technical projections can be applied to understand what it means for them in their communities and in their different sectoral occupations, for example. So the 6 case studies that we undertook were in the Cook Islands, we looked at the black pearl industry. For Papua New Guinea, we looked at both coffee and cocoa. Samoa, we also looked at cocoa. For Fiji, we were asked to work on the impact of climate change on root crops in the future. And then later on in our, as the project evolved, we also undertook a health study that was targeted actually across the whole Pacific region. So overall, we looked at 5 different countries across the Pacific, covering 3 different sectors. So that's the fisheries sector, agriculture sector, and health sector. Having the opportunity to, at the same time, do 6 case studies gives us not only the insight into those different targeted crops and commodities, but to sort of compare across the case studies as well, which was can be informative. So, for example, we can look at the difference in impacts in for cocoa, comparing Papua New Guinea and Samoa, for example. What we did, and one of the ways that the case study was set up was we designed it so we could look at the best case outcome for 2050 in most cases. And then also what would happen in the worst case. And that those best case and worst case were dependent on both the way that we expect the regional climate to respond to increases in emissions, but also looking at the different levels of emissions that might play out into the future. We are putting together some guidance material. We hope that will be uptaken by the Pacific communities, both at the university level and also into the community and village level, to help them understand these case studies more. And that's pretty much the broader overview of what we did. So it was a really interesting work, and I really enjoyed understanding and finding out more and more about the Pacific Islands and what they do. So that's all for me. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Leanne. And if anybody's wondering, my first name is Jeff, but I'm happy to go by Greg. And my second name is actually Gooley, but I'm happy to go by the name of Googly as well. That's a fun surname. Sorry, a little bit of a joke there from me. Okay, look, thank you, Leanne. And just point out that the work that Leanne and colleagues have undertaken in relation to these case studies will also be published very soon. The reports are in their final draft stage as we speak, and we are hoping to have them published and available once again on the rccap.org portal or website in the very near future. So please stand by for that information, because they are really very instructive and enormously useful, we think, particularly with the guidance materials that Leanne is also developing as we speak to help people understand and apply the science. Okay, with that, I'd like to go to our next panellist, who is yet another long-term colleague of mine, but we've got 2 panellists, actually. I'm very fortunate, from the Pacific. The first is my colleague, Sonny Suzu from, from Samoa originally, but present in Vanuatu as the acting program manager and climatologist from SPREP, based in Port Vila, as part of the GCF-funded Van Kera project that Sonny will hopefully talk about momentarily. So, Sonny, to you, can I please ask you to provide a brief overview of how the Next Gen Science and Associated Climate Information Services are being used to inform sectoral case studies of climate change impacts in Vanuatu as part of Vancouver. Over to you, Sonny.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and good morning to everyone. I'm Sunny, and I'm currently the acting manager for the Vanuatu Climate Information Services for the Resilient Development Project, operating out of the SPREP Vanuatu office here in Port Vila. In Vanuatu, we have benefited from a number of next generation climate science information, such as the historical analysis of current climate trends. We also benefiting from the next generation climate change projections for a number of very important variables, rainfall, temperature, and to name a few, as well as projected changes if the world achieve a 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius limit as per the Paris Agreement to assist the Vanuatu negotiators at the COP events. And lastly, we are benefiting and we're really happy to receive application-ready datasets developed by CSIRO as part of this partnership for selected regions of Vanuatu. We have developed 5 sector case studies focusing on fisheries, agriculture, tourism, water, and infrastructure. These case studies utilize next generation science and projections, which have provided really useful insights into the changes in the climate of Vanuatu in the years to come, and also addressing the key climate change vulnerabilities and supporting resilient development through the tailored climate information services focusing on the 5. If I may, Jeff, I would like to provide some practical applications of how we are utilizing this next generation information and science and projections, looking at a number of sectors. In the agricultural sector, we are applying climate change projections for rainfall and temperature and other climate-related data to better understand the future climate impacts on crops and livestock. The most critical climate impacts addressed by the agriculture case study in Vanuatu are the projected changes in the rainfall would therefore affect the crop productivity. We use climate change projections from cash crops that are important to Vanuatu. They create a lot of livelihood and income for a lot of people and family. Crops like kava, and through the use of projections, we've generated kava suitability maps showing how kava growth and distribution will change over time under different emission scenarios. And this has helped the project and the agriculture departments to start putting in place measures to adapt and mitigate long-term climate change risks underpinned by solid science information that is reliable. The agriculture case study is also aimed and already looking at improving the ability of the planners and decision makers within the department, as well as the agriculture sector, and farmers to plan for and respond to short-term and long-term impacts of climate variability and change on food and cash crops and the cash crop production in Vanuatu. So yes, we are targeting and providing critical information to the sectors at community level on the use of climate information into agricultural decision-making to inform and enhance resilient farming practices, but also to reduce climate-related losses and increase production. Looking at fisheries, we are applying next generation extreme sea level and maritime heat and wave projections to understand areas that are hotspots, areas that are high or low risk areas of Vanuatu. Critical nursery areas that are less vulnerable to marine heat waves are identified through the projections, and these areas identified for the establishment of marine protected areas that can help replenish fish stocks to adjacent high-risk areas following a coral bleaching event. These are also, there's also work on the way to overlay next generation projections on top of non-climate sectoral data, layers and, for instance, reef systems, location of fish eating devices, marine protected areas, seabed, seagrass beds, and mangroves. And that's where people go to fish and rely upon for their livelihood, according to not only to the fisheries sector, but the tourism attraction as well. let's move to the tourism sector, because I think the tourism sector and the infrastructure sector that I will talk about next are very important and unique, that there are no other case studies in the region that's looking into these sectors. So the tourism sector in Vanuatu, we're utilizing coastal inundation information and information scenarios and provide geospatial information to assist the Department of Tourism investment and the accreditation provisions to identify coastal areas that are where new tourism investments, new hotels will be placed, as well as to inform the current tourism operators on future risk of rising sea levels, coastal inundation events, which may interrupt the operations in the future. Moving to the infrastructure sector, Public Works is working with us, the project in the Vanuatu Meteorology Department, working towards updating its Vanuatu Road Resilience Manual, taking full advantage of the new extreme rainfall, temperature, and tropical cycle projections from CSIRO, and informing appropriate infrastructure design for road bridges and culverts to withstand hazards and their intensities. And this manual is a key instrument for engineers for the design, construction, and upkeep of road infrastructure in Vanuatu, and it has helped in terms of integration and demonstration of the use of common information in that sector. Lastly, I want to talk about communication of these products, the project and CSRO and the partnership that we have. We are working on developing operational tools to enhance the access of people to the next generation science information on the policymakers, government policies, and other government sectors. Bankcard will develop a portal with the assistance of CSRO, as well as the pathways employed to communicate science to all the stakeholders in all levels of society. We're looking at engaging the community, have a citizen science component to the portal. It's in the pipeline to increase the community participation and engagement, and allow people to provide input and observation back to VMGD, back to the scientists, so that we are able and want to validate and probe truth some of the climate models and projections that we provide. And through this functionality, the citizen science component will empower communities to the integration of their own traditional knowledge together with the science to increase their ability to manage climate change risk in the future. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Danny, and thank you for that really nice overview of the Van Kirip project and how, in so many ways, it exemplifies at a project level where the science is brought to life, and it's actually applied at a very practical level across multiple sectors to inform services, which in turn inform decision-making around policy settings and climate risk management in Vanuatu. I've been very fortunate in working with you, as you know, for almost 10 years. Sunny and I got to know each other when, as part of the so-called Pacific Australia Climate Change Science and Adaptation Planning Program, PacSat, which in many ways really reset the agenda and the scene for understanding of climate, the scientific understanding of climate change in the Pacific. And that project was preceded by the Pacific Climate Change Science Program. Over in total between the two programs, it was about 5 years and a lot of money invested and effort and time and effort by folk in Australia and in the Pacific and around the region to understand the science of climate change. And we were fortunate in meeting with you, Sunny, in those early days. And here we are, we're still working together now on this project that you've just described, Van Kirip, which has been such a fascinating, if not slightly challenging project along the way. So thank you for that. And with that, it brings me to our last speaker, who also we're fortunate and I've known for the same amount of time, but as a very, very young man, Bipen, still a young man, but an early career researcher in Fiji at the time of the Fiji Met Service. And if memory serves correctly, you started a mentoring and attachment role with CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology as part of PACSAP way back at that time. So I'm talking about you, Bipen Prakash. Now, I think you're sitting, if I did see you earlier sitting next to Philomena, I think you must be there in Glasgow at the Pavilion. So hopefully if you're still online, I'd like to ask you now, perhaps just drawing on that background with PACSAP and then what you've heard from Michael and Leanne and now just Sunny in relation to Vancouver. Just some of your reflections about the importance of capacity development in building the capability and capacity of Pacific climate change scientists, and how, as an early career researcher, your journey has evolved over that time to the point now where you can see this science as it is, concluding the next gen science and the recent IPCC Working Group 1 report. What does this mean to you as a scientist, a Pacific scientist, and how you see the future in terms of building that capacity across your colleagues, not only in Fiji, but across the region? Over to you, Bipen.
Thank you very much, Jeff and Bulavinak colleagues. My name is Bipen Prakash. I'm involved in operational climate services for over 12 years now. So I've been managing climate services at the National Meteorological Service of Fiji for past couple of years. So over time, I have developed a strong interest in the communication of climate change science. Currently, I am undertaking some further studies in Ireland, so I'm based in Ireland, doing some research work on climate change science again. So, what I'll try to do is to draw some lessons learned from, past climate change science program in the region, and in particular, like Jeff mentioned about PCC, SP, and PACSAP. And I would like to draw, the attention of the audience with reference to PCC, SP, and PACSAP project. It is regarded at that time and arguably probably still one of the most comprehensive piece of work on climate change science for the Pacific Island region. And I guess we can draw, while we can draw a lot of lessons, but I guess they deserve recognition that it is one of the most comprehensive work probably taken to date on climate change science for the Pacific Island region. Having said that, we can draw a lot of lessons learned from these projects, and I will touch on a couple of points. First of all, involvement of Pacific Islanders for ownership. So one of the things which PACSAP and PCC-SP did really well, it involved the Pacific Island National Meteorological Service really into the project itself. So all the Pacific Island Met services were involved, and this kind of resulted in the Pacific Islanders themselves taking ownership of the work and then communicating it to their stakeholders. So I think it's very, very important that the people for whom the service is meant, they are quite involved into the project. My second point is on communication. So at times we are too much focused on delivery of science, but I think it's very important that equal effort needs to be placed in communication, if not more. So there needs to be resources, time, effort, as much as probably in doing science itself. So I think it's very important that, and I guess that was one of the probably advantage of the PCC, SP, and PACSAP project. It had resources for communication. It made a lot of effort in the communication of science in the region. That's my second point. My third point is projections, projections relevant for planning and decision making. And I guess to some extent, Leanne touched on this. Providing regional downscaling it to national level is quite good, but we need projections which informs planning and decision making, which happens at a very local level. So I think it's important that our science is tailored to decision and planning and decision making at the local level. My last point is on capacity building. In the UNFCCC process now, there's a lot of recognition that people who are vulnerable, they should be empowered to speak for themselves about their vulnerability rather than someone else speaking for themselves. And in fact, in the our negotiations here in Glasgow at COP26, one of the outcomes of the research and systematic observations negotiation, we as parties, including the Pacific Islanders and Australia and all the parties to the convention have come to some sort of agreement that there's a need for fostering education as means to build capacity for climate research in diverse communities, including small island developing states. So going back to the PCCSP and PacSep work in the region, one of the things which worked really well with this project was there was, there was a lot of effort placed in building in-country, capacity, whereby, rather than organizing a regional workshop, there were, countries, country-specific workshops. So while Pacific Island, we are all small, but we are quite diverse as well. Some so some of the med services, for example, in the region are quite big, and there are med services which are small. So we all have kind of different, needs when it comes to capacity. So I guess in-country, workshops, trainings works quite well. But if we're talking about capacity building in climate change science research, I think, I guess probably there should be some effort to further strengthen them rather than just organizing workshops at a national or regional level. So the issue in the Pacific Island is that we are quite small. A meteorological officer in the Pacific Island is required to do from climate observation to climate change, seasonal prediction to climate change projections to climate monitoring. So from what probably couple of different organizations do in different developed countries. So I think it's important that I was personally involved, like for instance, like peer mentoring programs, which works really well. I personally feel, which allows people to leave their job for some time and concentrate on research for extended period of time, and they build capacity through time, and then some of this work which we did during PacSep and PCCSP work, we are still contributing in terms of science. So we work still very closely with, for example, with the Australian Bureau of Meteorology to maintain the Southern Hemisphere Tropical Cyclone Portal, which was an investment over probably more than 5-6 years ago, but it's still working quite effectively. We are collaborating, we are contributing to the science for the region, and everyone is benefiting. Another thing which probably can really strengthen capacity building in the region is to provision of scholarships to undertake research, and I guess to some extent it's happening, but I guess it needs to be strengthened. So I'm speaking, probably I can speak for national med services in the region at least. I think if there's opportunities for studying at institutions in different parts of the world, which would build their capacity to conduct and undertake science. It should be realized that Pacific Island contribution, while some effort has been made in recent times to improve our visibility in, for example, in the IPCC work, but we are still one of the most underrepresented region in this sort of contribution to science. So there's a lot of work which still needs to be done. Probably I will stop here, and I'm happy to contribute further if there's opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bipen, for some very valuable insights drawn over a long period of time, and they resonate very much with me, and I'm sure with our panelists, and indeed I'm sure also members of our audience. So thank you for that, and perhaps we might take the time now to reflect momentarily on that. But I just want to check in with our host in terms of time remaining. I think my understanding is we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. Is that right, Philomena? If someone could just check, let me know. Yes, okay, thank you. All right, in which case I'd like to encourage our audience to pose any questions in relation. Thank you, Audrey, 10 more minutes. I'd like to encourage our audience to pose any questions. They can put them into the chat function, I think, or the Q&A function in Zoom. And there's none there at the moment, but that's okay. And while we're waiting, hopefully, for some questions or comments from our audience, I might reflect on, I might ask our panel to reflect on Bipen's comments around how to build capacity and facilitate engagement across the civic science community with our range of stakeholders. And we might go in reverse order. So I might go back to you, Sunny, first, if you could, please, because if memory serves me correctly, you also were part of the PACSAP mentoring and attachment program. I seem to remember a very young Sunny meeting you in the bureau at one stage in Melbourne for the first time, you and Celessa. But any further reflections from you, Sunny, on how we as a regional climate change science community of practice within the Pacific can sort of enhance the understanding and application of science by building capacity, but also getting that outreach to the end users, including at local community levels. Any further thoughts from you? And then if there's time, I'll go to you, Michael, and Leanne, and then Michael. But also mindful, if anyone has any questions, please pop them into the Q&A function. So some brief comments from you, Sunny, and then Leanne and Michael. Thank you.
Jeff, yes, I think my personal take in relation to capacity constraints that exist in the Pacific that is constraining the uptake and the application of climate science in the Pacific. There's two layers. The first layer of capacity building need that exists is the building of the capacity of the national services and science institutions that provide the information. In the Pacific, there is high staff turnover in a lot of the med services. For instance, VMGD, Vanuatu Med Services, there's a high turnover of really good, capable people. So there needs to be train-the-trainers program and ongoing capacity building programs that needs to be embedded or housed, for instance, at the Pacific Climate Change Center, or at regional programs that the capacity of national med services and science providers is continually built and maintained so that the science generation of that science is maintained and sustained to benefit the sectors. The second layer that I want to also mention that also has capacity constraints are the capacity inside the sectors. And there are also systematic barriers hindering that relationship between science providers, like people within the VMGD community, and the user side, the downstream side of that climate information, science information. So again, the Ventura project is a really good example of where funding from the Green Climate Fund and the Government of Australia through development of the next generation projection information with the associated capacity building and training components that come with it helps not only the med services, but also the sectoral users in understanding how to interpret that information, how to translate that information, and how to apply that information in decision making, whether it's on the farm or out in the field in fishing activities and so forth. So definitely, we're grateful to the Government of Australia and also to the Green Climate Fund for the funding that has allowed the Aotearoa project through this partnership between CSRO, VMGD, SPREP, and Government of Vanuatu to build capacity of VMGD to generate that science with mentoring capacity building provided by our international science delivery partners, but also the funding that has allowed Vanuatu and the Government of Vanuatu to access CSRO and internationally recognized science institution and scientists who are working in the IPCC process to provide science that is relevant and tailored for Vanuatu needs, not only for VMGD as a science provider, but also used in the sectors. In terms of capacity building, there is a component in the sectors where they are providing that information downward to the community level, at the provincial level and area council levels. So there's also a need to not only look at the capacity issues, the translation of the information so that the community, whether it's fisheries associations or agriculture association or farmers association, is able to understand that information and use it in a way that helps develop their resilience and better respond to long-term climate change risks that come with it. So I'll leave it there and give the opportunity for others to comment.
Thanks, Sonny. And again, for some really valuable insights from very much on the ground there in Vanuatu, dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis. We actually do have, before I go to you, Leanne and Michael, we do have a question from our audience. This is from Rachel Nunn. Thank you, Rachel. And I see you also made an earlier comment in complimenting BPEN's reference to more efforts into communication. But your question is, and it's to you, BPEN, if I can come back to you again, just briefly, please. Thank you for all your insights. I'm just quoting here from the Q&A box from Rachel. If I may, how do you think Met Services have improved communication over the last 5 years? And how do you see that moving forward in the next 5 years? There is a second question there, but perhaps if you could just ask that first question, then maybe pick up the second question in the chat function when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, Rachel. Really good to hear from you. So with reference to your question, there's a lot of recognition by the Met Services in the region that effort needs to be placed. Our work at times tends to become quite technical, and our communication, the Met Services in the region recognizes that. And in fact, at the World Meteorological Organization level, recognizes the need for improving communication from the National Met Services. So very specifically, and in the interest of time, some of the things which we are working, or the Met Services in the region are working at present are things like impact-based forecasting, making use of social media for communication, development of videos for outlooks. For instance, in Fiji, we provide with the release of our every outlook now, climate outlook now, we provide a associated video, not only for climate outlook but as well as for ocean outlook. So and I guess there's a lot more work needs to be done. We are trying to simplify our forecast and our advisories. We are working with sectors, for example, in Fiji, working with sectors such as sugarcane, or with the electricity provider like Energy Fiji Limited, to provide them information which they can apply quite readily in their line of work. So in the interest of time, I guess probably I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bipen. And we are nearly out of time. I think we've only got a minute or two left. So maybe I might, in the absence, oh no, we do have a second. I was about to get you, Lan, sit tight. We have a second question from Joe Inlet. How do we incorporate and facilitate a mutual conversation between traditional knowledge or Pacific-grown science with Western-based scientific knowledge that is rooted in the methodologies that are rooted in Western philosophy? Also, how do we build capacity within scientific communities so that scientists can learn local traditional wisdom so that we can do a better job of facilitating mutual communication? So this is very much a question, or a couple of questions, contextualised around the role of traditional knowledge and how that works and complements, and vice versa, the so-called Western-based science. I'm happy for anybody on the panel to make a comment here, because it's very much an open question. So would anybody like to, Leanne, you've got your hand up. So Leanne, a very quick comment from you, and then one more from maybe whoever else, and then that might be about it. So Leanne, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Joe. I was about to discuss the guidance material we're preparing that will describe for the Pacific Island communities how to undertake these risk assessments. And in doing this, we hope to group together some people from the Pacific Islands, including people that understand the traditional knowledge that can actually inform how we actually connect better with the community. So that's one aspect of using this traditional knowledge, which hopefully will help the communities to better understand the science that we're presenting, which I agree can be quite technical. So that's my contribution to your great question. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Leanne. And maybe just to round out the commentary from our panel, and there's no further questions in the Q&A box, maybe Michael, one final brief comment from you in relation to either traditional knowledge or anything that you've heard from the other panelists and from the audience, just to close out our session. Thanks, Michael.
Something I didn't cover when I spoke was the connection between things like the IPCC assessment report and then regional reports that we've been doing jointly and so on. And I think it really is a system and interlocking kind of system where the international scene is really important, but doesn't go down to the detail that's needed. Regional partnerships are super important, and then local information sources is important, and traditional knowledge brought together with Western-based science as well. And I think just the more connections, the more relationships, and the more kind of communication, the better, of course. And COVID has been a real barrier to that, unfortunately. But people are finding ways around it, like by video. But I think kind of working at all levels in all ways is the recipe for success. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. And while you've been talking, there's been an entry from our SPREP colleagues, I'm assuming, in the chat function also, just alerting everybody to the core functions and the resources support that's available in this space from the new Pacific Climate Change Centre, which is, of course, based at the SPREP campus the SPREP campus in Apia. And I'm sure there's folk there in Glasgow that can help with those, point people to the right direction for getting more information about the role of the Pacific Climate Change Centre. Look, I think there's no more questions in the Q&A, and I think we're a bit out of time, just about out of time. So Audrey or Philomena, is our time up, or do we have time for any further comments from our panellists? No, we have, hang on, there's one new message. What's this? No, I think it's thank you so much. We're over time. Okay, that means we've got to wrap things up. So, all right, look, thank you first and foremost to our panelists for your time, Bipen, Sunny, Leanne, and Michael. Thank you to our hosts, SPREP, over there in Glasgow, and very much thank you to our audience of participants for listening to us today. This evening or today, and for the questions, and please do stay in touch and reach out to our colleagues in SPREP if you have any further queries, or directly to us, of course, in CSIRO. Thank you very much, and good evening. Hope you have a good rest of the meeting there in Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.